In this explainer, we're cutting straight through the political noise and the daily headlines. We need to expose the stark, terrifying realities of the 2026 conflict between the United States and Iran. This isn't a drill, and it's definitely not some distant hypothetical. We're looking at a timeline that brought the entire world to the very edge of unparalleled destruction. So let's methodically trace exactly how we got here and what it actually means for the survival of the Middle East.
I want to plunge you directly into the high-stakes climax of April 7th, 2026. Picture this. At exactly 5:36 p.m., the American president issues a final, uncompromising deadline to Iran over the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. In the hours that followed, the panic was literally palpable. Embassies across the Middle East issued urgent evacuation orders, frantically scrambling to get their citizens to safe harbors. The U.S. had already launched a preemptive strike on Karg Island, which, by the way, is responsible for 90% of Iran's oil exports. The world was bracing for an absolute apocalypse. And then, a jarring pivot. Just 90 minutes before the deadline expired, a sudden 2-week ceasefire was announced, mediated, entirely unexpectedly, by Pakistan.
To truly grasp the severity of that afternoon, you have to read the exact words issued by Donald Trump. Quote, "Today a whole civilization will end, one that will never come back." End quote. He added that he didn't want this to happen, but perhaps this is how it would be, going so far as to call Iranians animals who absolutely could not be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. Just let that rhetoric sink in for a moment. Human rights groups like Amnesty International viewed this as far more than just political posturing. They saw it as a direct threat of genocide. Legal experts, along with the UN Secretary General, issued stark warnings that intentionally targeting civilian infrastructure constituted a massive war crime under international law. To understand this, look back at the data. In just over 50 days of conflict, more than 4,000 people have been killed. Over 2,000 in Iran, more than 2,100 in Lebanon, 26 Israeli soldiers, 13 American soldiers. This massive loss of life occurred in a staggeringly compressed time frame. We are looking at the sheer volume of human lives completely extinguished in less than 2 months.
But we have to look beyond the geopolitical chess match. 4,000 deaths means over 7,000 families absolutely destroyed. Millions of people have fled relentless airstrikes, facing total societal collapse. These aren't just statistics or data points on a screen. These are severed lineages.
The escalation during that first month was systematic, and it was incredibly dangerous. The war officially began on February 28th. By March 21st, America and Israel had severely escalated the situation by targeting Iran's nuclear facilities, starting with a direct attack on Natanz. But the true terror, that arrived in late March, when 4 bombs were dropped in the immediate vicinity of the Bushehr nuclear power plant. Now, Bushehr is Iran's only functioning nuclear plant, housing tons of active nuclear materials. Those attacks weren't just tactical strikes, they were terrifying near misses.
If a single bomb had directly hit Bushehr, we would literally be looking at a catastrophe on the scale of Chernobyl, or possibly much worse. The Prime Minister of Qatar warned of this exact horrifying scenario back in 2025. Because the plant sits right on the coast, a breach would send radioactive material pouring directly into the water, entirely and permanently contaminating the Gulf. No water, no fish, no life, just endless disease and generations of radiation.
As investigators looking at this conflict, we have an obligation to dissect the official narratives being fed to the public and weigh them against the stark, contradictory evidence on the ground. Throughout the early weeks, the official claim from the U.S. administration was that America maintained, quote, total air dominance and that Iran was already militarily defeated. The ground reality, however, was violently shattered on April 3rd. Iran successfully shot down an American F-15E Strike Eagle fighter jet, carrying a pilot and a weapons systems officer. That single, isolated event completely unraveled the facade of complete American aerial supremacy.
What followed was a frantic, highly classified scramble behind enemy lines. While the pilot was quickly rescued, the weapons systems officer, an American colonel, was forced to eject. Despite his injuries, he hiked up to an altitude of 7,000 feet and hid in a mountain crack. He sent out a brief, harrowing radio message, "God is good." To prevent his capture, the CIA launched a massive deception campaign. Hundreds of elite Delta Force and Navy SEAL Team 6 operators were deployed deep into Iran. U.S. warplanes continuously bombarded Iranian positions just to keep them away. Now, they got the airmen out, but the cost was staggering. Amidst intense enemy fire and an A-10 crash, 4 U.S. transport aircraft were so badly damaged that the military actually had to destroy its own assets right there on Iranian soil.
Which brings us right back to the chaotic ceasefire announcement of April 8th. The official statement from Pakistan, who, remember, brokered the deal, explicitly guaranteed safety for Lebanon and all other countries during the pause in fighting.
Yet, within mere hours of this announcement, Israel launched its deadliest bombing campaign in Lebanon to date, executing over 100 strikes and killing more than 300 people. Both Israel's prime minister and the U.S. vice president completely contradicted the Pakistani and Iranian understanding, bluntly stating that Lebanon was never included in the deal. It was a glaring, tragic contradiction that exposed the fragile, almost illusionary nature of these diplomatic efforts.
And that confusion bled directly into the grueling 21-hour peace talks in Islamabad on April 11th. These were led by U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araki. Iran laid out a 10-point proposal. They demanded complete sanction removal, recognized control of the Strait of Hormuz, and U.S. withdrawal from the Middle East. But the core collapse? That happened over nuclear activity. Iran offered to suspend enrichment for 5 years. The U.S. firmly demanded 20 years. Without any middle ground on their nuclear capabilities, the negotiations completely collapsed by the morning of April 12th.
Immediately following the failure in Islamabad, the global shockwaves intensified. The U.S. Navy initiated a total, uncompromising blockade of Iranian ports, aiming to intercept even Chinese vessels. In retaliation, Iran played a highly volatile game with the Strait of Hormuz. They briefly opened it, which actually plunged global oil prices by 10%, only to aggressively close it again the very next day. Neutral countries suddenly found themselves caught in the crossfire. Indian-flagged merchant vessels, including a massive supertanker holding 2 million barrels of Iraqi oil, were intercepted and actively fired upon by Iranian IRGC gunboats. To survive this, India is literally being forced to continually request U.S. waivers just to buy Russian oil. The geopolitical ripples here have completely compromised the energy security of the entire globe.
The real question is, what happens in the shadows while the entire world is distracted by regional warfare? On March 30th, 2026, operating under the cover of the broader conflict, Israel passed a death penalty law for terrorism-related offenses. But when you look at the actual text of this law, it reveals a deeply discriminatory reality. It mandates hanging exclusively for Palestinians in the West Bank. If a Jewish Israeli commits a similar offense against a Palestinian, the death penalty does not apply. It is a very stark reminder of the grim, localized realities being aggressively entrenched while all international eyes are focused on the U.S. and Iran.
Now, we face a ticking clock. On April 17th, a separate 10-day ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon began, even though Israeli troops remain stationed in southern Lebanon. But the most critical date we are watching is April 22nd. That is when the crucial 2-week U.S.-Iran ceasefire officially expires. Historically, as we have seen time and time again since the Gaza war began in 2023, Israel often resumes conflict just as ceasefires near their end, essentially forcing the U.S. to align with its actions. Right now, global security is balancing on the edge of a knife.
If no permanent deal is reached before that April 22nd deadline, the risk of total escalation is absolute. And honestly, even if a deal is somehow brokered between Washington and Tehran, there is absolutely no guarantee that Israel will accept the terms. The human cost is already immeasurable. The nuclear threat remains entirely undiminished, and the political will for peace? It's fracturing by the hour. As countless families are displaced and an entire civilization is threatened with total erasure, we are left to confront one profound, terrifying reality. How long will this destruction last?